Good morning, everyone. How are y'all feeling today? Great. Um, I'm not going to say too much. This is, as Diane was saying, this session is quite important. We're featuring three people who are a part of the Learning Metrics Task Force. The Learning Metrics Task Force is co-convened by the Center for Universal Education at Brookings and UNESCO Institutes for Statistics. And this it's essentially the objective of the task force is to shift the global conversation of education access. So we've been talking this week about education for all, the Millennium Development Goals, the post-2015 agenda, and how there was a big push in getting children into school. But now it's time to shift that conversation to getting children into school and ensure that they're receiving a quality education and that they're learning. So I will allow the three members of the panel to talk about their work. But we have here this morning Kate Simons. She's from the Secretariat based out of Brookings. We also have Leanne Kwan, who is from the American Institutes for Research, and Pablo Stansberry, who's with Save the Children. And so without further ado, I'm going to let Kate get started.
Good morning, everyone. As Yvette said, my name is Kate Anderson Simons, and I work for the Center for Universal Education at Brookings. And we've been engaged over the last year in a process called the Learning Metrics Task Force. Actually, when we got involved several months in, we realized that this name really isn't that engaging or inspiring. It's very practical, and we're hoping that the recommendations and the things that come out of this task force actually we've come up with a better name, and we have a communications team helping us now finally. So, but I'll tell you a little bit about the process that we've gone through to get input from stakeholders around the world. And answer some fundamental questions on learning and how it's measured and how measurement of learning can improve quality. So as you know, the time is really right for this conversation around measuring learning. What we were hearing when the discussions were happening a couple years ago around what's going to happen after 2015 when the Millennium Development Goals and Education for All goals expire as they currently are. And, the idea, first of all, the Millennium Development Goal 2, which is access to primary education, was actually one of the more successful development goals. And so there's these conversations happening, the UN General Assembly, that wow, education is all done, it's a finished agenda, and we can move on. Let's focus on health. Let's focus, And so we came in and said no, 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 and so the first question we got asked was, well, if learning was to be part of a global set of goals, how would it be measured? Would it just be literacy? Are there a couple things maybe at the global level that all children and youth should learn, or is education and learning really too contextualized to be able to measure it at the global level? So we decided to investigate the possibility of having some sort of measurement of learning at the global level, given these opportunities. The other, in addition to the EFA and MDGs, the UN Secretary General in September just launched the Global Education First Initiative, and he, for the next 5 years, he will be advocating on behalf of education around the world. He appointed Gordon Brown, the former Prime Minister of the UK, as his special envoy for global education. And if you've heard him speak on this, or if you've been to the website, it's called aworldatschool.org. He is a very engaging advocate for education, and he will sit down with heads of state and ministers of finance and education, and really put the right kind of pressure on them to get all kids into school and learning. So all of these things kind of happened at once, and it seemed like it was overdue to have a global conversation on measurement. So really quickly, I'll just go through the first goal of the task force was really to build consensus on measuring learning in the global education community. So, not having some small meetings in Washington, D.C. with a couple experts and deciding what learning should look like around the world, but really engaging everyone that this work could touch in the process if they're interested. And the second is to develop concrete recommendations for measuring learning, both at the global level and at the national level. Third, it's really making sure these recommendations are translated into action. So part of the process is we're not waiting until the very end this fall when we're finished to release the recommendations. We are constantly putting out briefs and drafts, and I think you might have gotten a copy of the first report, Toward Universal Learning, What Every Child Should Learn. The executive summary is here. And so that we're involved in these conversations now, even as we don't quite have our final report yet. And finally, in the long term, we're hoping that this can really shift the conversation, as Yvette said, from access to education to access plus learning, and eventually improve learning outcomes. And so to do this, the task force, in our mandate is basically the understanding that robust measurement of learning outcomes, both at the global and national level, can improve education policy and learning levels. So even though in the scope of the task force in 18 months, we're not probably going to see a lot of improvement of learning on the ground, we actually have some strategies I'll talk about a little later to keep this going and keep the momentum going to actually see it through and see those improvements. And this is just another note on the scope, but as soon as we started getting people around the table, we were asked kind of to do everything under the sun. So are you going to set standards for teaching? Are you going to, some of the things, especially in early childhood being such a holistic field, are you going to cover parenting and water and sanitation and health and all these really important critical things? And what we've decided was to define our scope, that we're talking about measurement of learning outcomes, but we're constantly working with other organizations and groups to make sure that what we're doing is aligned with other efforts that are happening. And hopefully maybe when this is done, we will do a task force on these other things that are really important. And so again, the three core questions that we've structured the task force around. The first is what learning is important for all children and youth. The second is how should outcomes be measured? So as you can see, we took a step back because there was a lot of discussion around measurement of learning, taking what we currently measure today at a global level, which is primarily literacy and numeracy in primary school. And so what we heard in the very beginning was, yes, these are very important foundational skills, but there's a lot of other things that children should be learning. And it might be more contextualized, it might be more difficult to measure, but we should investigate what kinds of learning are important before we go to how it should be measured. And then finally, how can that measurement of learning improve quality? And that's the phase we're in right now. And so just a quick note on the structure. We have three co-chairs who are high-level kind of thought leaders in this. Sir Michael Barber, who is now at Pearson, but used to be the education advisor to Tony Blair. And Rukmini Banerjee from Pratham India. I don't know if you're familiar with Pratham's work, but they do a national survey of learning, a household-based survey of literacy and numeracy in, I think, almost every state in India. And then finally, Geeta Rao Gupta, who is the deputy director of UNICEF. And so they kind of help structure the conversations that we're having. And then we have task force members from 30 agencies around the world that represent their constituencies. So this is a political level group of organizations that meet together 3 times to deliberate and debate on the issues related to the questions we're asking. And then right here, actually, if you can see the blue, these are the working groups of technical experts, and we structured it in the beginning so that the technical experts could get together and work virtually to come up with some recommendations, and then the task force debates and decides at a political level. So, we had have a lot of conversations in these working groups of, which are comprised of my colleagues here, Pablo and Leanne, and about 200 others around the world have been involved in these working groups. And so the conversations would go toward, well, if I was an education minister, I would be, thinking this way, or I'd want to do it this way. And so we've been able to kind of stop that conversation and said, we're not education ministers. We are technical experts, and we're going to put forth some options. And if we don't agree, we can put forth several options, and the task force can decide based on, what they think is most politically palatable. So it actually kind of makes the job a little bit easier on the technical side, because if we don't agree, then we split up and give two proposals, and then the task force is really the one who wants to make that decision. And then finally, the secretariat is Brookings and the UNESCO Institute for Statistics. This is just a slide on the process, which I won't even bore you with, but we're about halfway through this 18-month process. So I'm going to talk just really briefly around the first phase, and then turn it over to my colleagues, who will talk about kind of how this work has been both informing their work and how their past rich expertise with their organizations has informed the Learning Metrics Task Force. So when we had this question of what learning is important for all children and youth, we, in the very beginning actually, kind of had some ideas, but we thought the best way to go about this is to put out a draft, a prototype, and say, these are the areas of learning we think are important, and get feedback from anyone who is interested in giving feedback. And so it was interesting, because we got feedback from about 500 people around the world. I think in the first phase it was about 50 countries. Not all of it was nice feedback, actually. A lot of it was very, very harsh, and in a good way. I mean, these issues, when you're talking about what should all children around the world learn, it can be very contentious. There's quite a few people who just really don't think that we should even be undertaking this exercise, which is completely fair. And and they also felt, when you put forth a draft, even if you put draft all over it, people think it's something official. And so we, fortunately, through all this feedback, and it was very rich, were able to take the considerations into account and come up with a framework that reflected all of the views around the world, well, to the best that we could. And one of the key findings, and I think this is going to transition into Leanne's presentation, was we tried to actually set some global standards, some very specific things on what children should know and be able to do. And we found that it really was too difficult to do that at the global level. So ended up taking a step back and actually proposing domains of learning and subdomains within them that we think eventually could be contextualized at the country level, but actually setting specific standards is an exercise that should be done at the national or even local level. So these are the 7 domains. I'm not sure if you can see all of them, but as I said, we have the report outside. But it's a very broad framework, and actually the early childhood subgroup was the group that proposed the broadest set of domains in the very beginning, and then people actually looked at that and said, well, physical well-being, why is that only in early childhood? It should go all the way up through secondary. Same with social and emotional. And so we actually, kind of, instead of, I think a lot of times, it kind of the push down of the academics onto early childhood, through this process, it was kind of the best practices from early childhood were pushed up to the higher grades. So that was very exciting for us. The other key finding was that the task force felt that there needed to be some sort of a hybrid approach when we're talking about measuring learning. So there might be a couple things that are tracked at a global level, and they might be some of the more easy things to measure, but they shouldn't be the only things that are measured. There should be something much broader, and I'm going to get into this a little later, but outcomes shouldn't be the only thing that is measured globally. There should be some conversation on the inputs, like are children enrolled in school or in preschool, and what are they learning there. And so with that, I'm going to pass this over to Leanne, and she will talk more about kind of, or Pablo, sorry. I'm going to pass this over to Pablo, and then I'll come back and tell you where we are in the process now at the end of the presentation.
My name is Pablo Stansberry. I am the Senior Director for Early Childhood Development at Save the Children. And I'm going to speak a little bit about Save the Children. I don't know, I've had a couple opportunities to share with some of the domestic groups, but I've discovered here in the United States, fewer people know about Save the Children than internationally. Save the Children And then I'm gonna preface, and then I'm gonna go back to talk more about what is this MDGs. Now, the thing I just circulated, and not all of you have it, is a list of the MDGs, and I've been informed there actually was a workshop about the MDGs. Do I get a shake, go ahead, or I'd like this? You could get a nod or a shake is fine. But there is this, just to remind you, a nice summary sheet. And then I'm going to talk about what's been happening with organizations like my own with regards to this discussion about the Millennium Development Goals and child development. So first, just to let everyone know, Save the Children, historically, there are many Save the Children's. There's a Save the Children UK, Save the Children US, Save the Children Norway, Save the Children Sweden, Save the Children Denmark, Save the Children Japan, Save the Children Australia. There's a lot of Save the Children's. And just this last year, they all came together. So now there's Save the Children International. Save the Children International employs 15,000 people. So it becomes a very big dinosaur in the world of child development internationally. One of the things that is a challenge is people enter the discussion about child development differently. For example, many of our European counterparts, they enter it, it's a child's right to have quality care, it's a child's right to have education, it's a child's right to have breastfeeding, it's a child's right. Most of us, and I'm a developmental psychologist, most of us in the US say, well, the science shows that if you breastfeed, the child's more nutrition. The science shows exposure to preschool leads a child to have better success in school. So coming to what is our platform for even talking about child development is a challenge. Because we don't mobilize unless we have evidence-based examples. You know, here in the US, that's the way we think. In UK or in Norway, they do things, look at this child with all the flies on him, they do dramatic, emotional stuff. All of them are also very important. It's just a discussion that we have ongoing within Save the Children, whether it's a right-based or an evidence-based, and we pretty much land at the same place, but the way you get there is a little bit different. So, with Save the Children, as I mentioned, there's 15,000 people, and one of the things that I think is a very proud thing to say for Save the Children, if we're in Jordan, if we're in Ethiopia, if we're in Malawi, Indonesia, in any of these countries, 98% of the people working there are from that country. They're not people that have been trained here and we send them out there. We actually have some of the best MDs, PhDs, Masters of Social Workers, child development specialists from that country working to develop the programs and then implement those programs, helping us with the evaluation. So it's a unique design. Many of our competitors in this field of providing service get consultants and they go and do the job for 3 or 4 years and then they're basically done. All of our competitors, not to disrespect them, they do work with consultants from that country, but we have people that are there all the time. For years, 10, 20, 30 years, they retire from Save the Children. So that's one of the things I think is an important spin for that conversation. In this particular slide, I think it's still a residual of when it was just Save the Children US, which are in the red, and then the yellow were some of our colleagues that were from, they did early childhood development programs, but I didn't know, particularly from the Washington office, what was going on there. Because they were managed from London or from Norway. And the other thing that is uniquely different between Save US and our colleagues, if you come from a rights-based, here's $10 million, Angola, for early childhood. Now go and do something. When we do it, it's like, okay, let's come up with an evaluation design. How do we know that that $10 million makes a difference? Evaluation and all that stuff that we get ingrained with here in the domestic side is new to our colleagues. So when we go into a program, we don't know what a quality early childhood development site looks like. This year, all of the Save the Children have come together, and there now is a quality learning environment tool that all of our programs are implementing, and it's the first one globally that's being implemented. And we have to be careful because very much of the things that were just mentioned by Kate were, is there a global universal definition of quality? And I'm going to mention, for those who you have extra time, there is a very good study by Joseph Tobin about preschool in 3 cultures. Preschool in 3 cultures, Joseph Tobin, Tobin. He did this, I think, around 96, 90, I can't remember. It's been a while. What he did is he went to China, he went to Japan, and he went to the US. And they looked at things like even staff ratios. You know, here in the US, I think it's 1 to, I can't remember, 20. But you get to some of the sites in China, they had 1 to 100. And the difference, and we think about, oh my goodness, child neglect, and how the heck do you do that? You know, the difference was the cultural expectation that children will self-regulate and they will peer regulate. So if a child is having a dispute, they don't come to the teacher to resolve that issue. It's the teacher will say, well, then don't play with that child. So they have to resolve it. So the children typically would separate, and the one child that's been acting out then will do sort of a self timeout and learn to come back and rejoin the group. They'll monitor that themselves. That's just one example, but there's a lot of differences in the study about how do you ratios, classroom size, curriculum, topics, of all those things that we think that we've come to and resolved the issue. Well, if you take it outside of the U.S. context, there's a lot of room for discussion. So there's a videotape on this. So when you do this on Google, Preschool in 3 Culture, I think it's actually very powerful to see not just what you have to read, but you can actually see the classroom and how it manifests in parental expectations. As you all know, parents have expectations when they bring their child underneath your care in certain child care centers here in the U.S. And if you're in a multi-ethnic community, parents come with different expectations of what child care providers should be doing. Not what they're doing, but what they should be doing. And so already a lot of the times there's a lot of conversations there. So I'll pause on that, but just to show the grasp, and this has expanded even more in terms of the colors, because the good news is, because of the MDGs, and I think, okay, I'll move on to the next slide just because you get bored of looking at one slide. Because of the MDGs, the first one here that I'm going to mention, goal number 2, achieve universal primary education. That was the primary goal that was set forth in 2000. Children need to get to school. At the same time, UNESCO has this initiative called Education for All. That actually started in 1990, prior to the MDGs, but they have the best way, goal number 1, to get children enrolled in school is get them into a pre-primary classroom. Because and we've shown repeatedly in our studies, children that go to a pre-primary class will enroll in school. They'll stay in school, because just because you get enrolled doesn't mean you stay there. Or you are doing your time on task and all that, doesn't mean that, but they will go to school. And then the third piece is they actually outperform those children that don't, cognitively and non-cognitive skill sets. So because of the MDG number 2, but let me take a step back, the Education for All didn't have any money tied to it necessarily. What the governments have to do is they need to go through the MDGs. These 8 guys is what mandates. If they increase the children who have access to primary school, they become eligible for hundreds of millions of donor dollars. That's the incentive. That's the carrot, right? So whether it's from the World Bank, USAID, DFID, which is the UK, and similar to all the donors have their funding sources, but it's trying to get the increase in access. So one of the ways that we have been very convincing is to tell them, if you put into place low cost but quality ECD programs, you will increase goal number 2. So suddenly there's this huge demand by governments for pre-primary. There's no money, really. Budgets are still very tight, but there's a demand for it. Now they realize it. It's been in the last 5 or 10 years that they're like, the light has gone on. You know, we have known this for like ever, but for some reason it took them, you know, up until the turn of the century really to actually get, you know, the early 21st century. So lights got on and people were wanting pre-primary. Then there's programs like Save the Children. Our funding comes from three primary sources. We do get funding from the public sector like USAID, but we also have these things called sponsorship, where people might pay $20 a month to sponsor a child. And in that way we're in 15 different countries, actually we just went up to 17 different countries, where we do this long-term investments. So when you do this sponsorship, you can stay in a community for 10, 12 years. We have to dance around how long is too long, because the point is to get out of there. But the third one is to go to foundations and corporations. And we have been very, very successful convincing Mattel Foundation, Hilton Foundation, Merck Pharmaceuticals, Mattel, Target, I don't know, there's a lot, Starbucks, as I'm drinking my Starbucks. They're supporting ECD in Guatemala. And they have another one in Indonesia. That's where your coffee comes from. They actually have some sense of corporate responsibility. But the notion being is we've been very careful to document that and to show that this investment makes a difference. That's your public-private relationships. From $1 million from a Starbucks program, can you then go to the government and say, if you give $10 million from your public sector dollars, will it take it to scale? You'll have that much more in effect. The second piece, or third piece here that's on the slide is Education First. And this one is a publication that came out just this year or last year, 2012, I believe. And this is hosted by or put forth by the UN. And this one is supposed to fast track the MDGs, the Education for All specifically. We're not getting our targets. We don't have universal access to school. So how are we going to streamline and get this on the fast track to get going? And that, Gordon Brown, who used to be the Prime Minister in London, that's his initiative. So these three things are what's driving the current discussion about child development, education in general, in the international world. What has happened is in the last year or 18 months, we've realized there are more bums in chairs, meaning there's more seats, not bums like this, you know. No, there are more children enrolled in school, but they get to the end of primary school and they cannot read and they cannot write. So the question now has begun to spin away from get access. So if I can go back, remember this is all about achieve universal primary education. That's access. Get children into school. Get children into primary school. And now the question has switched very quickly to away from access to it to what is it? I guess it's access with quality. And how do we define quality? What does a quality center look like? What does quality instruction look like? What is, in our teacher training colleges, what does a quality education graduate look like? Quality is the new term. And as Kate had mentioned, in this discussion, we in the ECD world, we know this stuff. We know there are developmental domains. If you go to primary, they don't talk about developmental domains. They do subject matter. And we love our colleagues in the upper sphere, but we're just saying, so what we have been really pushing, and Kate showed it, we've been showing that all children would benefit from this holistic, integrated approach to human development, to child development. So we have the developmental domains, and so when we Save the Children do projects, and I don't think it's just Save the Children, when we talk about quality, we're talking about is the child grasping skill sets in all of these domains. We don't just measure ABCs, 1, 2, 3s, shapes, colors, and the things that most parents even think. That's what the parents even want, not just the school district wants that because that's what's on the test in second grade or something like this. But parents want that. But we have to do donor education, parent education. You all know this, but this is the things that we actively do in our conversations about looking at quality. And Kate's group has been doing quite a bit of that. So these MDGs sunset, that's the language everyone uses, they sunset in 2015. So that right now, everyone is positioning what is going to be after 2015. We will not have Millennium Development Goals, because you know millennium means that happens at the turn of the century, at the 2000 mark. So you can't really have Millennium Development Goals in 2020 necessarily. You have to come up with something else. So it won't be MDGs, but I think the world has landed that this was the first time that donors and implementers like ourselves, everyone came together to sort of decide together, let's have some objective or measurable outcomes. So people feel good that they like that. There is a lot of discussion. I have to pause to say there's a lot of discussion from the Southern Hemisphere, from Africa or from Southeast Asia or from the Middle East. There are people that say that these came from the donor community down to us. We have to do what you told us to do. We didn't get to participate in the conversation. We would like to, whatever happens, participate in defining whatever the next goals will be for us that we can measure. So that's happening a lot more this time than it did in the 2015. In any case, in the positioning, there are 4 different pieces. There are a lot out there, but I'm just going to highlight these 4. And if you just Google these, I didn't bring the website, but these 4 pieces. UNICEF, which is a outstanding leader in ECD, they have a publication called The World We Want. And I think I have one. I have 1 or 2 paper copies here. Actually, it's like 130 pages, so I didn't print the whole thing out. But I printed out here just a couple of copies. But the words here are talking more about addressing inequalities. Governments could increase, and I'm rambling. Tell me if somebody give me the sign if I'm going too long. Governments will increase. You could increase the percent of children who have universal primary education, for example. It could go from 40% to 50% if you just saturate it all in the urban areas. For the children that are dropout and they're working in the slums or if you really give a lot of just to that area, you will increase. But what about the children in the rural area? What about the children with disabilities? What about the children who don't ever, the most marginalized? So the question now is about inequalities. The same thing with Save the Children. We have a publication out called Reduction of Poverty, and it has those same languages to it. The Early Childhood Development Task Force, if you go to on that website, it's called Consultative Group. I think it's www.ecdgroup.org. Anyhow, it's Early Childhood Care and Development Network. There will be several papers on there. That is the clearinghouse for international papers, conferences, and things like that dealing with early childhood development. And then the last one that you heard quite a bit about is the Learning Metrics Task Force. Okay? It is the consultative group on early childhood care and development, ECCD, I think. Early childhood care and development. Yeah, I'm usually call it early childhood development. And UNESCO uses the term early childhood care and education because UNESCO's mandate is more education focused. But the other people say early childhood care and development because you forget that there is there's care involved in child development, but I include that anyhow. But it's early childhood care and development. Yes, 5 minutes. Yes, I'll be done in 5. So again, I'm just going to hope the top line is incorrect, but the words here are what's popping up in the conversation. This is the language that you hear on almost every conference call at every summit. The Mozambique part you can get rid of. I'm sorry, I populated this. Equity, accountability, marginalized. So the marginalized population, the vulnerable, poverty reduction, disability, learning and development outcomes, as I mentioned, and then sustainability. These are the common pop words that you hear. You can interpret them differently, but I can just tell you that these are, it's pleasantly surprising that people in the development world, that they're really focused on orphaned, vulnerable children, marginalized children, disability. This language is front and center in the conversation. I find it really nice to hear versus, just access, I just find it really nice to hear because it's the forgotten groups. I think I'm finishing with this slide. So this one was circulated some at the turn of this year. And I'm going to try to rephrase it, but I think it's really interesting to see the slide on equity versus justice. And when you look at, if you distribute resources equitably, look at the difference of the three young boys on the left-hand side. They all get the same resources, but the children that have the highest, so I'm using size, defined by this, who are exposed to the greatest risk factors. So the children that are smaller have the highest risk factors. They could be orphans, they could be children with HIV, they could be, of course, poverty, they could have single parent, teenage parent, what have you. I mean, when you have the synergistic effect of multiple risk factors, the data is clear, those are the children that have the greatest challenges. So if you look across, so I'm doing the smallest child has the greatest risk factors, sort of think reverse, and then it goes. If you distribute resources equitably, it doesn't really get where we're going. But if you distribute them based upon kind of where their needs are, what protective factors they have, this child that's the taller child, he already has, in that, the taller children have more protective factors. They actually have intact families and they're middle class or higher in education, and they don't necessarily need, they can all benefit. I think in this picture on the right side, I would put some sliver of box in there because I think all of God's children benefit from some child development intervention from our field. But the notion here is distributing them differently based upon risk factors and the existing protective factors really changes the discussion. There's my email, and I'm going to pause due to time. And I have a few soft copies I'll put on the table over here.
My name is Leanne Kwan, and I am a senior researcher at the American Institutes for Education. I have spent most of my education career in domestic education, US-based education, and probably about 3.5 years ago, I moved into international development. And it's interesting to hear Pablo speak because when I went into international development and started dealing with education in developing countries, access was front and center. And I said, what happened to quality? Because that's really what, in the US, quality has been front and center. And so dealing with access issues was a completely new and different thing for me. And I'm glad we're starting to turn the conversation to quality. Now, I'm going to be talking about learning standards, and my background is really as an assessment specialist, or as we know in this country, psychometrician. And in my career, I've dealt a lot with standards, learning standards, because I've had to develop test items to measure what kids are learning in the classrooms. So I come from it from a very indirect route. So I wasn't really sure the nature of the audience that was going to be at today's session, so I decided to really tone it down a little bit and really get to the rudimentary concepts and begin with these concepts first before moving on into describing some of the work that I've done in conjunction with the World Bank. So when I talk about learning standards this morning, I'm really talking about content standards, which identify what students should know and be able to do in the classroom. And learning standards also encompasses process standards, which really gets at how students learn this content knowledge. And the third standard that I refer to as part of learning standards are performance standards, which define how well students are learning the content and skills that they're expected to learn in the classroom. So between content standards that identify the what, process standards that identify the how, and performance standards that identify the how well, we're looking at learning from that perspective. So the purpose of learning standards, as I see it, is really to publicly identify what's valued or recommended or required of students to know and be able to do after instruction. They provide clear expectations for what students should learn, and therefore clear expectations for what should be taught in the classroom. Learning standards also communicate and allow for better preparation and communication among educators, parents, and education leaders. But you can't really talk about learning standards in isolation because learning standards really work through different components of education to really drive student learning. And these components, as I see it, are curriculum, instruction, teacher training, and assessment. And all these components in education really work dynamically to improve and raise student learning. And I never really thought about it that way until I came into the international arena because, you know, in this country, everything seems to be functioning at the threshold that it should be functioning. And so I've never really considered what would happen if one of these pieces were not functioning very well. And in my experience, I've noticed that it actually makes for a very dysfunctional system when curriculum isn't well written or teacher training isn't done well. You can't really have an education system. And which is why it dawned on me, we can have a standards-based education system, but if all the other components aren't working well, your standards are really not going to bring about the types of change that you want it to bring. So as part of why countries may adopt learning standards as solutions, I've identified four different ways in which learning standards can help solve an education problem that's faced by countries. So alignment is one of them. Alignment allows standards, when used to solve an alignment problem, really sets the foundation and ensures consistency and purpose, consistency of purpose and focus of the education system. The other thing I think about when I think about standards-based education is really efficiency. It solves the efficiency problem because it focuses content that's taught and learned. It focuses content so that it's taught and learned in a coherent manner. Equity is another important concept that comes to mind when I think about standards-based education system. It provides common opportunities for all students to learn at high levels because you define a set of knowledge and skills, and these knowledge and skills are expected to be taught to all students regardless of whether they live in the rural villages or they live in urban centers, whether they're male or female, boys or girls. We expect all kids to learn to the same set of knowledge and skills and with the same degree of proficiency. However, equity can only go so far if you don't have an accountability system that's tied with it. And accountability allows for the monitoring of education quality to ensure that student learning goals are being met. And standards provides for that framework because you can't really measure if you don't know what you're measuring. And standards really define what should be measured because and what really matters to an education system. However, there are unintended negative consequences. So alignment. So if components in an education system are aligned to poor quality standards, it is unlikely to bring about change. With efficiency, education systems can become rigid, and flexibility and creativity can be limited if the content is too specific or too directive. Along with equity, you can exacerbate learning standards can exacerbate existing disparities by introducing unreasonably high standards. And likewise, if your standards are unusually high or unusually low, then it can be misleading. The inferences that you make about student learning can be misleading. So that for every solution that standards can bring to an education system, there can be unintended consequences as well. So at this point in time, I want to turn the conversation to a World Bank funded project that I did a couple of years ago called Systems Approach for Better Education Results. And in short, it stands for SABER, and some people call it SABER. So, so pick which one sounds better to you. It's Target and Target in the 90s. So I'm going to stick with SABER. So SABER was a World Bank funded initiative from a couple of years ago that was funded through the Russian Education Trust Fund. And as part, SABER was consisted of several different subsystems, and we basically took the learning standards subcomponent of SABER. And it was intended to be an evidence-based program to help countries systematically examine and strengthen the performance of their education system with the ultimate purpose of improving economic development. And SABER was also part of the bank's new education strategy for 2020, which emphasizes learning for all, as opposed to education for all. So the scope of this work was to develop a set of materials that would allow countries to measure progress towards learning standards, towards standards-based education. There were several deliverables associated with this piece of work, which included a paper describing key policies and a conceptual framework for understanding standards, and I believe this was distributed prior to the session. We also developed a toolkit which include rubrics, questionnaires, and country reports. So a country could actually use these rubrics and these sets of tools to actually evaluate where they are on the development continuum. We conducted 6 case studies in Bihar, Chile, Jordan, Namibia, New Zealand, and Singapore. And all these countries have undergone some form of standards-based education reform. And so the papers, the case studies actually describe the process and their experience with standards-based reform. And we visited 6 countries, Armenia, Jordan, Mozambique, Nepal, Peru, and Vietnam, to look at, to actually develop and validate the rubrics and the tools that were part of this project. So if we take the perspective that learning standards actually define what's important for a country, the goals, educational goals of a country, and by that I mean that these are skills, knowledge, and processes and attitudes that students should learn throughout their education, then what are some of the things that we need to take a look at to evaluate whether standards are actually making a difference? And so we decided that supportive conditions for development was one of them. Technical characteristics was another important component for us to look at in terms of, whether a country is actually making progress in their standards-based education. And the third was conditions for implementation. So with supportive conditions, we wanted to take a look at whether policies existed to support the development and use of standards, whether there were adequate resources allocated to the development activities, whether leadership was available to provide oversight to these development activities, and whether key stakeholders were involved in the development process, and whether these stakeholders also have a clear understanding of why standards are being adopted. So these were some of the indicators of supportive conditions that we took a look at in our rubric. In terms of technical characteristics of learning standards, we looked at whether standards were developmentally sequenced, grade or course specific, measurable, informed by standards developed in high-performing countries, as defined by international benchmarking studies like TIMSS and PEARLS and PISA. Contextually, whether the standards were contextually and culturally relevant, and whether they clearly defined specific through specific examples of what students should know and be able to do. So, and these are only a subsection of the indicators that were part of our questionnaire for this particular work. We also looked at conditions for implementation, because what good is having a set of standards that are technically sound? What good is it to have policies that support the use and the development of standards if the conditions for implementation are not there? And so a country that is involved in standards-based education need to really think about the conditions for which implementation is taking place. So the first question really was, are these standards even disseminated and publicly available? Because if they're sitting somewhere on a shelf at the Ministry of Education, it's not really making a clear difference in education. Can standards be adequately taught within the academic year? Are they just way too broad? Are there far too many standards and it cannot be covered? Are the standards available to educators? Are there adequate resources allocated to the implementation of standards-based education? And are all the components of the education system, whether it's curriculum, instructional materials, teacher training, national assessments, are all these components aligned and influenced by the content and process and performance standards? There were challenges to this work. It was supposed to be an evidence-based program, but as I mentioned before, standards really work through other components of the education system in order to drive student learning. And so it's really hard to actually find empirical evidence that support that when you introduce standards into a system, it just ultimately transforms and increases student learning. Because if the teacher professional development isn't done well, or the curriculum's not done well, and they don't align to the standards, then it affects student learning. So it was really hard to find empirical evidence to support why standards were important. The program also just provides a snapshot of what countries are doing. It doesn't drill down into the quality at which they're conducting some of this work. So it's really more or less, if you will, it's a diagnostic self-assessment so that countries can really understand what are some of the weak points in their education system and try to strengthen it that way. The third challenge that we came across was really terminology differences. So in this country, we refer to it as content standards, process standards, and performance standards. We go into a country like Ghana, Zambia, and say, well, do you have content standards? And they say no. But actually they do, and they call it learning objectives. And in Namibia, it's called learning competencies. In New Zealand, it's learning achievement objectives. So they're just different terminologies that are used in different countries. So I do know that for the pros and cons, that we have different camps. And there's some people who love them, and there's some people who really hate them because of, all the unintended consequences that standards bring. But if you were to consider the conditions that we work in, and you've been hearing a lot about it over the course of the week, I believe that there is a finite amount of knowledge that all of us as individuals learn, and we continue to learn throughout our lives. And but there's also a baseline knowledge that students need to learn and be able to do before they can create and innovate. So before I can become a creative writer, I have to know how to write a very basic sentence. I need to know how to read. I need to know how to spell. And I need to have a pretty darn good vocabulary. So before I can start writing creatively. So I do believe that standards do serve a purpose. They do identify what these basic competencies are so that we can ensure that all students have access to this learning. So I brought with me some pictures that we've taken in different countries. So this is a classroom in Vietnam. And as you can tell, the classroom looks nice and spacious. It has a library in the corner, and you have all these kids sitting. It's not overcrowded, is really what I wanted to say. And over in Ghana, you have more kids within a smaller space. And again, this is a classroom in which students are sheltered from the elements. We also went into classrooms in Ghana that were conducted under trees. And this was in the, in really the hot season when we went. And so it was humid, it was hot, but the kids are learning. And this is actually one classroom. And this is the teacher's meeting room. Again, under a tree, around one table. And you may or may not have enough chairs for all your teachers to sit at. But this is a school. And this is Pakistan. Again, in a rural setting where children are learning outside and they're using stones and rocks as their chairs. And this group of students are really taking a test. So we work in very different conditions around the world. And because of this, it's hard, how do we ensure that all students are getting the right opportunities and the equal opportunities to learn the content and skills that they need in order to become productive citizens? And I feel that standards at least is one entry point that we can do this to ensure that maybe that we define a content to ensure that even students in the far-flung regions of a country are getting this opportunity. I'm not sure how we're doing on time. Should I turn it over? A couple more minutes? So I wanted to share a little bit about how standards can make a difference. And this is really from some of my own work. So this is my report card in primary school. I went to school in Singapore, and so this is my report card. It doesn't really tell you much. It tells me that, with my writing expression, I got 48 out of 50 correct, or in my final exam, 97 out of 100 marks. And over here, it tells me how I ranked in my class. So basically, this is a report card from my first grade class. And this is a report card 7 years later when I was in secondary school. Again, it gives me continuous assessment information by subject area. It tells me what my end of semester examination marks were, and it gives me my overall grade for the entire year. But it doesn't, again, it tells me how I did. It doesn't tell me what I can do better. And over here, I was rank ordered. They took a total percentage, and then they tell me what my promotion status is, and then my teacher has a remark at the bottom: has worked hard this year. To me as a student, I didn't really know what I needed to improve on. I just knew that English is a first language. I didn't do as well as I wanted to do, and with Chinese, there was a lot of room for improvement. And I want to take you into reports that I have designed as part of my work in the United States. And this is where standards can make a difference in reporting, in contributing to information that teachers need in order to make instructional decisions. So over here we have standards at the top of the report. And at the bottom of those standards, we have the test question and the correct answer. And over here, at the bottom of the report, it really tells you the overall percentage correct by standard, by item, and then the most common incorrect response that was given for that particular question. And what is informative about this report is that if you look at these two standards, you can tell very easily which standard kids seem to be doing better on and which ones they seem to have a little bit more problem. The incorrect responses are actually, the correct responses are highlighted in green, and the incorrect responses are highlighted in pink. And this allows, you know, going back to the previous reports that I showed you, which didn't give you enough detailed information, this at least tells me what areas I did well in and which ones I didn't do well in. It tells me, you know, for the standards, for the items that measured a particular standard, I did well on this. But for items that targeted another set of learning expectations, I didn't do so well. So it gives you more information than what my report cards did when I was in elementary school and secondary school. So I just wanted to leave you with that and turn it over back to Kate.
You know, Pablo and Leanne both gave a really good overview of some of the challenges that we face in trying to have a global conversation because learning is so contextualized. And, you know, we realized early on there isn't really a lack of measurement in education. It's more a lack of kind of helping understand how to use measurement effectively and how to use it in a way that really ultimately improves learning. And so with that in mind, the second phase of the Learning Metrics Task Force was addressing that question. How should we measure learning? So the way we went about this, this next working group doubled in size from the first one. So we had 57 members in 23 countries. Again, global north, global south, pretty evenly represented. We invited international and regional assessment bodies. Sorry for the acronyms, but these basically, I'm sure some of you are familiar with assessments such as the Trends in Math and Science Study, the TIMSS, the Progress in International Literacy Study, PEARLS, the PISA, the Program for International Student Development. There's also 3 regional assessments in sub-Saharan Africa. There's a French language exam called the PASEC, and I don't know what that stands for. I'm sorry, I can't say off the top of my head. And then SACMEC is Southern Africa, and it's the Anglophone version. And the Laboratorio Latinoamericano that does the same thing in Latin America. So we invited all these groups. Not all were able to participate in this round, but to really get them thinking about, you know, what are some of the things that we can say at the global level. We also had a wide range of expertise. So in addition to these assessment organizations, we had, you know, experts that are doing research on culture and arts education in indigenous communities. We had, you know, we had grad students, we had people that work at the policy level, we had a lot of international organizations like UNICEF and UNESCO, so it was a very broad group. And we had this meeting in Montreal, Canada in January, which was freezing. And we had my poor colleague from Kenya came and was like, what, you know, it was negative 27 degrees. And so we huddled together and thought about, you know, what can we recommend to the task force, the technical recommendations. And we actually disagreed. There was a group that said, we've been doing, you know, there's been these international assessments of literacy, numeracy, and science. They've been going on for the last 15, 20 years. And we should use these as the starting point. Why reinvent the wheel? And there was another group that said, well, you know, we're trying to create a framework that's going to be relevant for, you know, hopefully the next 15, 20 years. And there's got to be a way to think beyond that. Another issue that came up was, for a lot of countries, if you want technical expertise in learning and assessment, you know, people, psychometricians like Leanne, are actually very scarce in a lot of places. And so if you want the expertise, you have to buy into an assessment system. And so you don't get kind of neutral advice on how to assess children. Or maybe a donor has, you know, a certain tool that they want to use. So in order to get the funding, you use that assessment. But really, you know, making decisions on the best way to assess children depending on your national curriculum, it's difficult to decide. I was actually at an education ministers meeting in Mauritius, and the Minister of Education from Rwanda came up to me, and I had just given a very brief presentation, and he was asking about certain assessments, and he said, what about this one? Should I use it? And I said, I'm honored that you're asking me, but this is not, the way you decide how to assess all the students in your country through, casual conversations. And so we really found that there was a need for better decision-making and neutral, unbiased decision-making that wasn't linked with testing organizations, although at the same time tapping into their vast expertise and technical capabilities. And so what we came out with, and then this was the consultation process for that period, and we tested some ideas around global goal setting. So we thought, might there be a basic minimum that all children should achieve, and also a basic desirable level that hopefully all children should achieve, but have like an incremental way of getting there. So we don't set a very high standard that some countries wouldn't even really try. But also not just set a very low standard that other countries may have already met. And there was mixed feedback on that. Some people felt that it was setting two sets of standards. We didn't intend it that way. We thought it was to show the progression, but really they felt that there needs to be a much more nuanced kind of benchmarking system, that not just a low and a high. So that was very, very interesting. And we also felt that a lot of people really supported the internationally comparable assessments, and a lot, the ability to rank your country in comparison to other countries, felt that was really important. Others felt that it was really not useful and actually could have unintended consequences. And so, again, all these debates going into a task force meeting in Dubai in February. And so this is our task force members, again, those 30 organizations from around the world, representing the civil society, the public sector, the private sector, and international organizations. And so what came out of that meeting is, one of the big decisions we had to make was, okay, with this next round of development goals, we're pretty sure now, because of all the advocacy our organizations have been doing, and I'm sure many of you have been doing, there's a recognition that education should be included in the next round of goals, including early childhood education. And learning is starting to get on the agenda, and people are talking about how that might look. So if we don't decide as Learning Metrics Task Force, which is this global consultative process, what that might look like, somebody else will. Somebody outside the education field, someone, at the last minute in 2014 might just pick something and put it in there. So we had to come up with some recommendations. And what we came out with was 6 areas of measurement that we think could be tracked at the global level in all countries. Now, not necessarily starting tomorrow, but it's kind of the vision for a holistic way of measuring learning, based not only on what is technically feasible, but also what there's a demand for. So I'm going to go into a little more detail, but there's some areas of learning that we don't really have good metrics on now, but there's enough of a demand that we should explore developing them. And then and this is kind of where that disagreement in the working group came up. They felt you can't just put forth these metrics without having some sort of support system for countries to be able to actually do this. And financial resources are one piece of the puzzle, but actually the technical resources, like I described earlier, are a really important factor in measuring learning. So having access to that, you can't just put this out, say all countries should measure this, and then walk away. So the second decision was to explore the feasibility of some sort of neutral body that could provide technical expertise, that could convene stakeholders, that can maybe continue this consultative process going forward, because as we said, the task force was a 18-month process, and it will end in September. So, this is kind of maybe the next phase. And so here's the 6 areas of global measurement. I'm actually not going to spend a lot of time on this because I'm going to go into each one, but what I want to highlight is the little asterisk at the bottom, because the task force felt very strongly that just measuring, just an absolute measure of learning outcomes, so actually kind of what Leanne put on the report card, like just one number, is can be helpful, but we should also look at growth over time, and equity disparities, especially around gender and urban or rural areas and wealth or income levels. Felt that not competing with the neighboring country or countries in a region or around the world, but looking at how you are serving the students and children in your country, and where are there gaps. So I won't spend a ton of time, but the first thing, which talking about learning metrics, we know that access is important. It's actually already being tracked really well, but without explicitly saying this is important, we still need to have access to learning opportunities. Without saying that, it almost kind of put the conversation of, well, if we're just looking at learning, maybe we shouldn't get all the 61 million children who are not in school, because then, we have, maybe we could increase learning levels by excluding children. So we wanted to make sure that wasn't what would happen. And it also includes not just formal education, but non-formal, even virtual. I mean, we don't know what the classroom is going to look like in 20 years, and so that was a big part of it. The second was about learning opportunities. So, if you think about the task we had 7 domains of learning. We had 3 different age groups: early childhood, primary, post-primary. So that's 21 different areas in which you could look at metrics, and we shouldn't really be doing that much testing, So how do you measure the opportunities children are exposed to? And I know actually in early childhood does it better than some of the later grades, looking at the environment, looking at the teachers, looking at the curriculum. This idea, in the beginning, it was kind of, let's just look at national curriculum. It's easy to do. We've actually done it in quite a few countries and, check the boxes. But now we're hearing that probably isn't going to be sufficient, as you all know. But it might be a good starting point to look at what's, the policy is. So early childhood and readiness to learn in primary school was something that the task force endorsed. And this is kind of, I'd said literacy and numeracy are most widely measured, and they are featured in this, but this was kind of one of the areas that isn't really tracked so much at the global level. And so the task force decided that at least 5 domains, and these are roughly similar to the 5 domains of the National Education Goals Panel that we talk about. And there's some tools that are internationally used for this, but there's also a lot of tools in development at the country level and at the regional level to measure learning in early childhood. So we decided on readiness for primary school. There's a lot of other things. Of course, the first question people ask is, well, what about 0 to 3? What about 3 to 5? And so we're actually working with UNESCO and UNICEF and others, Pablo, to have some sort of conversation around the other indicators, because we, the World Health Organization, for example, has a lot of data on the very early years. UNICEF has a lot of data on, kind of the 3 to 5 age through their multiple indicator cluster survey, the MIX. So we thought this was an area where there actually isn't a lot of consensus, and that would be our focus, but we're working with those others. This is about reading, and I'm not even going to really go into it because I've talked a lot about it. And the second is numeracy. So these, again, were the things that people were pretty sure would end up in any sort of global framework, and they have. And then finally, there was this idea that there's a skill set out there that we're roughly defining as 21st century skills, maybe global citizenship skills. These words are being used, and we don't really have a good measure of it or even an idea of what we're talking about. And so these are some of the preliminary ideas about what that might include. It might, go across domains. So just as in early childhood, we look at holistic assessment across domains. The task force felt that in lower secondary, middle school, high school, that some of these, there might be a holistic measure that could be developed. And there probably are out there. We're looking into it, but at the global level, nothing really exists yet. There's components of some international assessments that cover this, but nothing really looking at some of these skills that are most relevant in the 21st century. So that's something that we're definitely looking into. And this final group will be addressing, what does that look like and how might it be measured? And we've had some really interesting ideas. I mean, a paper pencil test. I just actually did a consultation with the Youth Advisory Group to the UN Special Envoy for Education. So these are 15 extremely talented, bright youth from around the world who came together and sat with us and talked about, what's learning going to look like in 20 years? And how would you want to measure that kind of learning? Like, are we going to be taking paper pencil tests? Okay, and there's a new concept called stealth assessment where children play interactive games, and underneath with the analytics of the kind of games they're playing, they can track it and tie it to creativity or critical thinking or things like that. So maybe is that what assessment might look like? And so these youth are really helping us, and they gave us the idea to do a Facebook consultation for the last phase to really get youth involved in what learning might look like and how it should be assessed. So I'm going to actually skip through and just kind of tell you about what we're going to do in this final phase. So the final working group now, again, doubled in size, so we have about 125 members from around the world. And they're going to work on a couple of things. One is developing a roadmap for countries, and we're going to be doing some country consultations around the world to say, depending on your level of capacity, what does the roadmap look like? Is there a rubric? And I know that Saber or Saber has done a lot of work on this, and so we're definitely looking at that model and looking in countries. One of the countries we'll visit is South Sudan. That's at the very beginning of their educational system and measurement. And we actually met with a delegation from the ministry who was in town this week, and they're actually thinking about a lot of these things and immediately go well beyond literacy and numeracy and say, what about these critical thinking skills? So we're really excited to talk with them. We're also talking with, we'll be doing consultations in Hong Kong where they have a very highly developed capacity for measuring learning. So we'll be developing this roadmap, and again, not really sure what it's going to look like. And then also talking about communities of practice that need to be there at the country level. So who needs to be involved, what kind of questions to be asking. And again, this idea of a neutral international advisory group, that how could it be supportive? We don't just want another bureaucracy. So how can this group really be inclusive and supportive and give countries and what they need? And even, again, since it wasn't in our scope, but how can they give teachers maybe what they need to assess children? We haven't focused as much on formative assessment in this exercise, but this body could maybe take that conversation further. So that's where we are. I'm going to skip through, because I've kind of talked about this already. So anyway, here's the information. You have our website, and my director, Rebecca Winthrop, is the kind of official Twitter handle for Learning Metrics Task Force. So you can follow her and get a lot of updates on what's happening. And just thank you so much for listening to me today.